Здравствуйте, товарищи. Welcome to day 4 of Russian Through Propaganda. And this is a big day for us. Now that we've learned the alphabet and how to pronounce Russian, we're going to learn how to write Russian the way Russians normally do. And today we're broadcasting from, just off Red Square. Yesterday we were still on Red Square, and you saw this gigantic building called the GUM, which stands in Russian for Главный Universalny Magazine, the main universal store, if we're translating literally. So basically, like a gigantic department store, shopping mall. And today we're stepping inside. You see behind me there this atrium-like space with this gigantic glass ceiling. And it's hard to convey the scale of this shopping center, but to give you some idea, what you're seeing in this picture behind me is one of three corridors of this type, right? There are three of these. They're called linii, or lines of the GUM, all of course lined with shops, and each of them are 3 stories, I believe, if memory serves. Yeah, at least 3 stories. And so anyway, it's a huge shopping center. It's really nice. And again, it's just right off Red Square. It's opposite Lenin's tomb and the wall of the Kremlin that we saw the other day. And by the way, one little tip. GUM has this, aside from a really fun kind of Soviet-style stolovaya up on, I think it's on the 3rd floor, maybe the second, I don't remember. But anyway, there's this old school stolovaya in there. But maybe more fun than that is the ice cream they have there. Ice cream is мороженое, and they sell in these little kiosks in GUM. There are several of them. This old kind of Soviet-style ice cream in little cones. So that's kind of a favorite. It's very inexpensive. So stop by and get some next time you're in Red Square and need a little refreshment. Okay, so after today, you're going to know how not only to read in Russian, but how to write Russian. And this may seem, again, extremely daunting, but my experience is that sort of like with just learning the Cyrillic alphabet, it may seem completely foreign at first glance, but I've found that students, even really after a day, to be honest, or especially after a few days, they seem to write cursive pretty effortlessly. And of course, I think one reason for that is you've probably learned cursive of this kind in school. I assume they still teach it. So you probably know kind of the general idea here. And a lot of the cursive letters we're going to see today are going to look just like English counterparts. One difficulty is there is some, again, interference. Some Russian letters in cursive look like an English cursive letter that it's actually not, right? So there's this interference we have to overcome in some cases. Another thing to mention is that I think it's kind of hard to say, really. You never know when you're making these generalizations, but I would say generally that more Russians write in cursive than they do in the US, at least. And this is something we all learn in elementary school, again, I assume. But I think later in life, a lot of people they get, I don't know if lazy is the right word, but they really stop caring much about their penmanship, quote unquote, and they just kind of write in print and kind of do their thing. Russians may do that too, and maybe it's a trend. I really don't know. But I think you'll notice that when you get like a handwritten note, for example, in Russia, it'll tend to be in this traditional cursive. So there's that. Note number 2 is, when you need to know how to write Russian yourself, right? And if you don't learn this kind of standardized method, what you tend to get in class as an instructor is this kind of free-for-all where everyone's chaotically inventing their own written alphabet, and that's not very, very good, right? We need to join the collective, right? We need to be good communists and do what everyone else is doing, right? Do what we're told to do, follow the established pattern, right, and be disciplined about it. Now, of course, I'm joking a little bit. When you're writing, of course, everyone's going to have their own personal flair. And so I don't want to pretend like the patterns we're going to show you today are, like it's some kind of rule, of course. So what we hope to show you is just the basic forms of each of these letters. Of course, any individual Russian may sort of have their own little variations. Everyone's handwriting is different and distinctive, and that's important. So we don't want to discourage creativity or whatever, but there are some things that we're going to point out that are really quite serious because they can affect legibility. So those are the things we really want to make sure you're avoiding, and we're going to take a lot of care to point those out. And so we'll see that when we get to it. Another important reason to learn cursive is not only being able to read, like handwritten stuff that you get from Russians, but also imagine other places where you see handwriting. One great example is like in cafes or restaurants. All the time they have blackboards set up, much like you see in the U.S. quite often. And I feel like it's even trendier now than it used to be for some reason. And you see, handwritten daily specials or whatever it may be. A lot of times in Russian, that's also going to be in cursive, and so you want to be able to read that and be able to place your order. Also, in like store signs and elsewhere, right? Think like in English, we have different types of fonts or typefaces, and some of them are cursive, right? They look like handwritten items, and you see that quite often in Russia. Again, for like names of stores or just whatever it may be, signs and store windows that aren't like the print letters we've seen so far, but that more resemble the cursive we're learning today. Third reason is that if you see printed italic, even in formal, like Roman font, traditional fonts, a lot of times the italic letters will look more like the cursive letters we're learning today. And if you don't know that, it can be quite puzzling sometimes to spot these, to puzzle out what these letters are you're looking at. So anyway, there are a number of reasons I think to take this really seriously, and not just, I would recommend not saying, I'll just print or whatever. I think, again, if you're serious long-term about learning Russian, this is something you really want to learn. And it turns out to be quite easy, I think. Okay, so let's get started. A couple of notes. First of all, we said already that Russian in print, like if you open a Russian textbook, you're not going to see the stress marked for you. And we've mentioned already that's a serious difficulty, right? A native speaker simply knows which syllable is going to be stressed, but of course we have to just learn that, and that's going to be a great chore, quite honestly, as we move through Russian. But again, for now, we're most worried about just seeing how we're representing it in the textbook by underlining the vowel. Another way to do that if I were writing, I would normally not underline the vowel. I would put an accent mark above the vowel instead of the line underneath it if I were writing and marking stress. And you'll see that on the answer keys where I'll do that, usually in red pen. And by the way, that's also how, if Russians were marking stress for whatever reason, that's how they would do that. But when you're writing exercises, I normally don't ask students to mark stress. Some instructors will do that, and the reason I don't do that is kind of twofold. First of all, Russians don't do it, so I feel like if you're learning how to write the way Russians would, why would you do something that they don't do? To me, it doesn't really make sense, even though pedagogically it might make sense to the degree that you need to learn where the stress is marked. But I think generally maybe it's not a good idea. One additional reason is that I've had students join my class after being in classes where they are taught to always mark stress, and it seems to turn into a bad habit they can never stop doing. And again, that may be okay for sort of grammar exercises, but you want to learn to not do that when you're writing in normal Russian. So I would ask you not to mark stress on just an average grammar exercise unless you're asked to. There will be, topics we'll cover where the issue really is learning where the stress is. For example, next chapter when we're learning verb conjugations, you need to learn the stress pattern. And so I will ask you to, in this sort of contrived fashion, mark the stress. But if you're not asked to specifically, I would recommend not doing it. Okay, so let's turn now finally to the cursive. Let's start with kind of some general principles. Of course, the whole point of cursive, any cursive script, whether it's, when you learn to write cursive for English, or whether you write Arabic, right? Arabic, they use, even in print, the printed script, right, resembles a cursive script. And it's kind of the same point, right? You write words out in one continuous stroke for the most part. You join all the letters together as long as they can be joined sort of in a more or less natural fashion. And the idea is not to have to pick up your pen and put it down again constantly, right? Instead of doing all these separate strokes, you get one continuous stroke per word. And so that's the general point with Russian cursive as well. So we're going to write out each word continuously to whatever extent possible. And then at the end, like think in English, we have to lift our pen and go back and dot our I's and cross our T's and so forth, right? We have to do that in Russian as well. And there are three, well, I guess really four letters where you have to do that. Here are some examples. The first one is adding the hat to the letter и краткое, right? So let's pretend we're writing out the word война. We're going to do that in one stroke. And when we do that, when we finish that single stroke, we're going to be left with what you see there. But then we have the one additional step where we go back and add the hat over the и краткое. Of course, that's very important because it distinguishes the и краткое from the e. And in this example, if you didn't do that, you actually have a different word. Instead of война, you have what looks like воина, which means instead of war, it means of the soldier or of the warrior. So you want to avoid that kind of confusion. The second example is with the letter cha, right? The Russian looks like an X, right? Let's write out the word плохо, meaning bad or badly. Well, we're left with what you see there on the left, right? Плохо, but we need to go back and add that cross stroke to the letter cha. Otherwise, we're left with what's going to look like a g, a lowercase cursive g. So if we don't add that stroke, this looks like плохо, which isn't even a word. Okay, so we need плохо. Number three, we have two letters that do something kind of similar, and these are both optional, really. But I'd recommend it probably for at least in the beginning. The first one is adding an understroke to the letter sha, right? That hushing consonant, right? When you're finished writing out a word with a sha in it, go back and put a stroke underneath that sha, right? We'll see why that is later when we start looking at other examples. What happens is a lot of times in Russian, you get these kind of, with particular words, you get these kind of endless strings of what would look like an endlessly repeating English cursive U, right? Just kind of over and over. And it can be kind of hard to read that visually. And so that's one reason why putting this stroke beneath the sha just kind of makes it clear that visually that, okay, that's a sha, even in combinations where that might otherwise be hard to kind of distinguish. The other place you can do this is with the lowercase t, which you see looks not really like a printed t at all, right? It looks kind of like an English cursive M. And so this is an example of this kind of interference we have. We have to, kind of overcome these old associations. And maybe it's a little bit easier to spot that as a T if you put this stroke over the top, right? Now, personally, I still, to this day, I put the stroke beneath the sha, but I don't normally put a stroke above te when I write it in cursive. So it's kind of a personal preference, I guess. I would recommend it, especially with the sha, but I guess ultimately it's up to you. So before we turn to actually learning the letters, let's just talk about some general principles and some of the things we really need to pay attention to that, if ignored, could actually lead to legibility problems. So the first one is kind of a general point, right? As we said, the idea is to connect all the letters, right? One letter flows into the next uninterruptedly whenever that occurs kind of naturally, right? So don't force it. If a letter happens to end near the top of the row and the next one starts down at the bottom, then it's going to be unnatural to connect those. So in that case, you would just pick up your pen. So look at an example here, the word большой, this adjective meaning big. Right, we have a couple of problems, right? You notice how the b, it ends way up at the top, and b does not connect ever to following letters, period. And you see kind of why, right? If you came all the way back down, you have some kind of loopy looking crazy thing. It ends up making the following o look sort of like a v, so it's visually very confusing. Now here's something that's a bit maybe less obvious. Look at the next connecting, the next two letters, O and L. You see how the O, at least the way we're writing it, it ends up near the midline, right? Whereas the L starts with this very conspicuous hook, more on that in a moment, at the bottom. Again, you don't want to connect that because if you do, it's going to look like you have an extra letter in there. It's going to probably look like you have a G or something. Now, the O is a good example. I do know that some Russians write that a little bit differently in such a way that it can join naturally to the next letter from the bottom. So you may see that again. I don't want to pretend like there's only one way to do this, but The way we're going to learn it, the way you see the O written here, which by the way is the way we write O in English. So I think that's the way that'll come most naturally to you. You would not want to connect that to a following letter that starts near the bottom. Look at the soft sign, right? That normally does not connect. Now, if someone's writing in a hurry, they might connect it. So it's, again, one of those things. It kind of depends on how careful you're being. But if you were to attach that to certain following letters, it may end up looking like an E. Right? So if you have enough of these little things going on, it may make a word difficult to read. Again, you see with this example, большой, how we've written out the body of the word, and then we go back to put that stroke beneath the sha, and then put the little hat on the ikratkaya, and we get большой written correctly there. The next thing is that, by the way, the easiest way to do this really, instead of watching this video, maybe just to consult the sheet I posted on the site that has a little diagram showing all of these letters. And you'll see as you're referring to that, where if you have questions or have difficulty, look carefully at, first of all, the arrows, the numbered arrows. Those are showing you the numbers of strokes that you would normally use to write one of these, the given letter, and also the direction, right? So I think if you follow those numbered arrows, you'll see more or less how you're forming these letters. Of course, we'll do it together here in a moment. Perhaps more importantly, you'll see little dotted lines extending from the letter that are kind of charting the way that could connect to a preceding or a following letter. Right, so those are sort of the trajectories by which you could connect that letter to its neighboring letters. So again, if you're kind of stumped, how should this letter connect? Be sure and consult those. And some letters in particular are a little bit counterintuitive this way. They'll join not from the bottom, as you might expect, but from the top via what I call a little hump, right? A little, like a camel's hump. Two conspicuous examples of that are ka, lowercase ka, and lowercase n. Also zh, but that's kind of just hard to write to begin with. I think maybe you're less likely to make this mistake there. So again, we'll practice that in a moment, but I remember when I was learning this way back when, that the lowercase ka and n gave me a little trouble because I found it just a little bit counterintuitive the way it was being formed. By the way, note that some of these, like the K, right, it really doesn't quite look like the normal English K, right? So again, it does look like a K, but not like the cursive K we're used to. So anyway, but before we get to the alphabet, let's look at a couple of additional things that are tricky. Watch for, we have here kind of like back in elementary school when you were probably first learning to write. You've got the ruled, right, the rows with the top line and the base line and the midline, right? So try to stick to those general guidelines. A couple of things. It's really important to watch out for those letters that are confined more or less completely to the bottom half of the row. And again, some of the Russian letters do this where the English ones wouldn't. Like, look at this word koltso, right? Note how the K is confined to that bottom half. The L too, again, unlike an English L, is confined to that bottom half. And sometimes students want to make it big and go all the way to the top. That looks pretty weird in Russian. Russians just don't do that. The soft sign as well there, see, after the L, that's also confined entirely to the bottom half. And if you don't do that, you could easily get what looks like a V, right? Looks like an English B or a Russian V. And again, that causes legibility problems. Letters that have the little tail, that is the ts and the sha in Russian, right? That little tail that we can see in the printed version, that's also pretty small in the cursive version, right? You don't want to go overboard and make this gigantic loop going all the way down, because if you do, for example, that can look less like a ts and more like an u in Russian. Okay, so again, you see how these things we're pointing out, they can easily cause legibility problems. The er is another example, the Russian er, which looks totally unlike an English cursive R, looks really more like a P. And you can see how that first stroke extends quite far down, really. And then the second one doesn't. So anyway, we'll watch out for those things as we're going through the alphabet. The next one is also extremely important, and this is one of the most confusing things. This is easily the most common, really mistake, and we should really call this a mistake because this is something that Russians, they don't do it. They always observe this rule. You know, it's kind of funny. The other day I picked up an Italian, a Ukrainian grammar, and it also introduced the way Ukrainians write cursive, the exact same thing, right? It pointed out that you've got to do this before these three letters, L, M, and Ya. So this really is not optional. Why? Because it can affect legibility. Okay, so just remember L, M, Ya, those three letters, they need to begin with a little hook, a little downstroke that looks like a hook before you move up and start actually writing the letter. Okay, so let's look at some examples here. Let's start with Ladna. Okay, there we have an initial L, so we're just starting to write the L out of the blue, right? It's not connecting to anything. And we start with just that little, tiny little hook, right? You see it's no big deal. Doesn't seem like that big of a deal at least. And we get Ladna, Ladna. But now look at the next word, Zhal, Zhal. Okay, there we have the L connecting to a previous letter. And note how when we finish writing our A, right, Ja, and we come up, we start a little upstroke after the A in order to connect, hopefully, the following letter. We have an L following, and we have to go up a little bit, then come back down and begin our L. And what you end up with is a little notch, that little indentation, or we're going to call it a hook, that clearly distinguishes the L. If you don't write that, if you don't include the hook, it can easily look, for example, like a G. Right, so once we go through all the letters, you'll see sort of how this interference can crop up. And so again, you have to write that. Let's start with, let's look at another example with the M, right? M with mats, mats. Okay, again, there we're starting with M from scratch. And so we start with that little hook before we write out the body of the letter M, mats. What if M is joined to a previous letter? Again, let's say, for example, the word we write our oo, we're coming up from the bottom, and instead of going straight up and diving into our M, we need to make that little hook. We need to come back down again, make a little hook, and then write out our M. If we miss the hook, that could easily look like ooch, for example, ooch. And so again, we need that hook. Final letter is Ya. It also starts with a hook. Let's look at a word with an initial Ya, Yama, which is like a hole or a pit. So it's just an example, right? We don't need to really know this word. But again, we start writing out our Ya with that little downstroke, our little hook, Yama, Yama. And there again is another M, right? Another M, Yama. Now let's look at another word with a non-initial Ya, Gryaz. Gryaz, meaning dirt. Okay, we write our G, we write our Russian R, and when we're done with our R, we're coming back up again in order to, again, hopefully connect it to our following letter if possible. But here we need to go down again, right? And we end up with that little hook, that little notch, and we go back up and form our little Ya. Now, why is this so important? Well, the way, if you're writing kind of hurriedly and maybe a little less carefully, and instead of making that sharp, almost 90-degree angle up there in the upper right-hand corner of your Russian Ya, it can easily look like a yeah. Okay, so that's kind of the obvious legibility issue that we're trying to avoid with the hook. Okay, but again, this is just how Russians write these three letters. It's really important. Now, here's the next thing to really remember, because this is also a very common mistake. It's something that Russians would never, ever do, right? So we want to avoid it. It's kind of hypercorrection, right? So you're told you always need this little kind of indentation or hook. And so what happens is students start doing it even when you have an M, L, or Ya as your initial letter. So for example, look at these mistakes, right? Here's an incorrect mats. You see what's happened. There's this extra stroke down there that's really quite weird looking. That's not correct, right? We need mats without that downstroke, without that extra notch. Okay, same thing with an initial L, Ladna, right? You see there it is incorrectly written, and there it is the way we want to write it. This can also happen if even in the middle of a word where you can't join the L, M, or ya to the preceding letter in, again, a convenient way. Again, let's take this example of or. The way we're writing or, we end up near the midline, and you can see it's just very unnatural to not pick up your pen and go back down and start writing an M. You want to pick up your pen, but then you want to start with a clean M, right? It's like as though it were in an initial position. It's not connected to anything. And so you start with that simple little hook shape without the hyper correction and that extra stroke that ends up with this weird looking notch. Okay, so that does it for the hooks, as I call them. Let's look now at the humps. So we're thinking like the hump on a camel's back. And this is a little bit less of a problem, I think, than the hooks. The main issue here really is just to watch as we're going through the letters, again, how they can connect to a neighboring letter, right? Is it up at the top? Is it from the bottom? And if they do connect at the top, do you need a little initial hump before you start really forming the letter itself? That's especially important with, for example, pa and te. Look at the word papa, for example, right? You see you have the two pas there. Initially, you usually have some kind of a little hump there, and you end up with two humps, right? Not everyone may begin writing a pa all the way from the baseline, but that's basically what it'll look like. The next letter, the te, right? Same idea. We end up with three of these little camel's humps, right, in order to make our lowercase cursive te. Watch other letters like sha and e. They join from the bottom. They don't start with this hump. So look at these examples like shum. Well, we have a sh here, an initial sha, so it doesn't really start from the bottom. We don't need to connect it to anything. We just have it kind of sitting there. We would start that from the top. Then we have an and then look at the hook, right, with our m, right, joined to the u via that little hook. Another example, aini, right, or. Now look at how it joins with the n, right? It comes up, and we're left with this little hook, right? Then we finish our n, and n ends at the bottom. We come up and immediately go right into our e. We don't make a separate hook as we go to write that e. That's sometimes students do that. That happens every once in a while. That's a little mistake we have to correct. So again, just note on a letter by letter basis, kind of check your work, make sure you're joining the letters correctly, and refer to the dotted lines to see, to check yourself if you have questions. Let's look at the example Raman and point out a couple of these issues. So Raman o. Okay, so we write our o, and the way we're writing o, we're finishing up near the mid line. And so if we're going to write a following M, we need to pick up our pen, go down to the bottom without connecting, and starting our M with that little tiny hook. Then we write our A, and as we're completing our A, we're coming up from the bottom. Okay, so what if we want to connect a following N? Well, again, this is one of these letters that joins via a hump, right? So we need to come up and make this little camel's hump, right? And then come back down before we start really writing out the actual N. And so a couple of little mistakes, right? Look at this example, Raman, where you've come straight up and then you dived straight back down and you get this kind of sharp edge. So we don't want to do that, although I do think maybe some Russians write like that. In fact, if you look at the little the poster there, I think it's not really a poster, it's from a textbook or something. It doesn't matter. For day 5, you'll see that the ends are being written like that. So I guess that's not really a mistake, but at least I wasn't taught to write my ends like that, and I wouldn't recommend that you write them like that either. I think a more serious mistake is, and this you do get this sometimes, where you make just a single stroke upwards, and then you pick up your pen and come back and connect it with this horizontal stroke, and you get what really does look like a rather weird little N. I suppose it's legible, although it does kind of look like a ramach or something. But, so anyway, you see the way we're recommending that you write your ends. Okay, so now that we've covered the major caveats, let's go through the alphabet fairly quickly. And again, you can pause the video and practice writing it out yourself. First comes A, So there's a kind of a fancy uppercase ah. Lowercase looks just like the English, right? So with most of these letters, there's not really a whole lot of commentary. Next comes ba. Now, one general problem that's quite common is students forget how to write the uppercase letters because maybe unless you're dealing with people's names or names of cities or something, you don't write them nearly as frequently. So do take special care with that, and we will expect you in my class at least to write, distinguish between uppercase and lowercase letters, and be sure to know how to write the uppercase ones. The uppercase ones don't always look simply like a big version of the lowercase one. So ba, you see you've got this initial stroke and then this hat on top, this long kind of wavy horizontal stroke that's written separately. A lot of uppercase letters don't connect to following letters. Some do, but a lot of them don't. Now the lowercase ba, you want to circle that one. A lot of people, it's kind of counterintuitive. It doesn't look like any English cursive letter, and it never joins the following letter. So you see how there we have only one stroke, and again, for reference purposes, you see how there's no dotted line coming off that tail end of the ba, right? That means it's not going to connect in any shape, form, or fashion. Okay, next we have va. Looks pretty much like an English cursive B, so not really very difficult. You see the lowercase, how it can connect fairly intuitively, I think. Next comes ga. Again, pay attention to that uppercase form. I kind of laughed. I always tell, this is one of these that students forget how to write, and I say, this isn't how you write an uppercase ga. And it's not the way we're going to write it in class, although I was in the Prokofiev Museum in Moscow, and I saw his manuscript for the score of Ivan Grozny, and he indeed wrote his uppercase ga with like a large lowercase ga. So I guess, if Prokofiev did it, who am I to say that you can't write an uppercase ga like that? But I guess if I'm in charge of my own class, I will be asking you to write the ga the way you're shown here. And indeed, I think most Russians would write it like that. But again, who knows? Okay, so anyway, look at the lowercase ga. That's maybe a little bit more unusual. It's just kind of a backwards S, really, kind of a little squiggle. Not much to it, but it may take a little practice to get used to that. Next comes da. Okay, here's one where we get major interference. You might want to circle this one, the lowercase one. It looks like a cursive G, doesn't it? It looks like the way we write cursive G, lowercase in English. So that's easy to write, but we've got to remember that that's da. Okay? Okay, next comes yeah. Pretty easy to write. The lowercase looks just like an English yeah. So no difficulty there. Next comes yaw. Very easy. Just write the dots over it. Now remember, Russians normally would not do that unless there's some ambiguity, and they need to be very clear that this needs to be read as a yaw. And we will see, I think in chapter 3 is where we'll introduce this one example of an ambiguity where that's the difference between two very different words. And so in cases like that, you might want to write the double dots. I will point out, I feel like lately it's becoming kind of trendy for Russians to write the double dots. I've noticed this in several places, both in printed books and also in text online. I've all of a sudden seen the dots appearing all over the place where, traditionally that would almost never be done unless it was a case of ambiguity where a native Russian speaker could not even easily tell what it was. And there are cases like that. But anyway, so it's something to watch for. Maybe it's changing a little bit. But anyway, that's how you would write it if you were writing it. You just add the dots. Okay, next comes the zh. That's a tricky letter, obviously. You might want to practice this quite a bit. This is written in kind of 3 parts. If you're trying to break this down, it's a single stroke, but you can think of it as 3 components. First, you make a little hump. So this, you see on the reference sheet, there's a little circle there pointing out that this is joined to a preceding letter via this little hump, right? We need to make a camel's hump. Then we come back down and we loop backwards, cross back over, come up. And now I remember again learning to write this myself. You come straight down, right? So step 2 is this straight line straight down parallel to your first stroke, straight line, then again, sharply back up, and you do kind of a mirror image of part one, right? So you loop again backwards, back over the line, come back towards the bottom, and trail up, and there you conform to a following letter if convenient, right? So again, watch those three steps. Hump, down, cross back over, come up, straight line down, then straight back up, loop back, etc. So you see the pattern there. Practice that quite a bit. Okay, next comes ze. Pretty easy. The uppercase looks like a giant 3. The lowercase looks like an English lowercase z. That's the way I was taught to write it, at least. So that's actually not too difficult. And visually that may be a little bit confusing, but if you kind of zoom out, that lowercase looks kind of like a 3 as well, right? So you see that in a lot of ways that resembles the Russian Z more than it resembles the English Z. Okay, next comes E. That's pretty easy, but again, maybe a little interference. It looks a lot like an English U. So next comes the kratkaya. Looks just like the E, as you might expect, but we need to put the hat back at the end of the word. When we're done writing out the word, we come back and put the hat over the I kratkaya. So also pretty easy to write. Okay, next comes ka. Again, this is a little bit tricky. Especially the lowercase. Note that it's confined entirely to the lower half of the row. It starts with this hump, and technically, when I was learning this, I was taught to write it as 2 strokes. I don't do that anymore. You can just simply write it as 1 stroke, and you see the way I'm writing it there. But that can take a little practice, even though the result does look pretty much like a printed ka. Okay, next comes the L. We talked about that. There's the hook, right? Watch for that. Note also it's got a sharp point at the top, right? It's not a little loop. It's not a camel's hump. It's a sharp point. And again, the lowercase, note how it's confined to the bottom half of the row. Similarly with M, right? We've got the hook to watch out for, right? And yeah, it looks, note that it doesn't look like a cursive M in English. It looks more like the printed version of M, right? May take a little bit of getting used to, but not too difficult, I think, ultimately. Okay, next comes N, which looks like an H, of course. And this pretty much resembles its printed counterpart. Note how it's confined to the bottom half again. Note how it opens up with a hump on the, especially in the lowercase form there, if it's being joined, right? Watch out and make sure that you make that bar across, that horizontal bar, keep it horizontal and more or less straight. Sometimes it starts getting kind of squiggly, and it can, if it's overdone, it starts to get hard to read, right? So make a nice horizontal bar there in the middle of your Russian N. Okay, next comes O. Looks just like an English cursive O, right? So that's not really difficult. Again, note how that ends up near the midline. So if you are starting a subsequent letter from down at the baseline, you would pick up your pen and not connect the O. If you do connect, it's going to look very weird. Next comes pa. Note the uppercase pa looks kind of like pie, right? And then the lowercase pa looks like a cursive N, basically, in English. So we have to watch out for that. But you'll get used to it. Note the hump, right? We've got that initial hump as we discussed. Next comes er. Okay, look especially at the lowercase one. This can be a little bit confusing. It doesn't really look like anything in English cursive, certainly not like a cursive R. And the main thing to note is, first of all, how that initial stroke descends pretty far down beneath the baseline. Then you come up and you leave that how should you put it? You don't close the loop, right? You leave it open at the bottom. See that gaping hole at the bottom of your er? A lot of people, they think that, generally Russian er looks like English P. And the cursive sort of looks like an English P, but not completely, right? If in English cursive P, we would complete that loop and make it a full circle. But in Russian, you leave that open at the bottom. So that's a pretty common mistake, to not leave that open at the bottom. Okay, next comes Russian S. Looks like a C in English, so not really hard to write, but we have some interference issues maybe. Next comes te. Look at the uppercase te. You see that looks quite a bit different from the lowercase. People always forget this. It's actually 4 strokes. And the lowercase te looks like an M. It looks like a cursive M in English. We have 3 humps, especially that initial one. If you're joining it, you need to start with that extra hump. So that's, again, more interference. It'll take a bit of getting used to. Remember, you could optionally add a stroke above the te, but note that I haven't included it on the reference sheet because I don't normally do that. I think most Russians don't do that. That would be my guess. Again, I haven't seen a study. I feel like traditionally they did that more often. If you see like old manuscripts, I've noticed in like I think Pasternak, for example, the poet, if you see manuscripts of his poetry, you have these gigantic lines that seem to go on all over the place above his tes, if memory serves, just as an example. But anyway, I think most Russians don't do that anymore. But if you want to, it's certainly your choice. Okay, U looks basically like an English Y, especially the lowercase version, so it's not really hard to write. Next comes F. Now this is a little tricky. It's an unfamiliar letter, right? Note that the uppercase letter is 2 strokes, usually written in 2 strokes. So pay attention to that. Lowercase one is going to be a single stroke, right? You sort of come up and write, it almost looks like a Q or something, right? You make a loop, then you come straight down, then you go straight back up, and basically it's like you're writing an additional cursive P in English, right? So you kind of have a first circle, a stroke straight down, going pretty far beneath the baseline. Then you come up and make one additional circle, and then you come back up to, if possible, join it to the following letter. Okay, next comes Cha. I think most Russians would write this uppercase one in 2 separate strokes. And some people, I think, even write the lowercase one like that. So again, if you like that, who am I to tell you can't do it? I was taught to, the way we discussed already, make a little squiggle, right? Kind of like a backwards S, almost like the way you would write a Russian lowercase ga in cursive, right? So you write that out. You're left initially with what looks like a ga, and then when you're done with the word, you come back and put the cross stroke and write your cha. If I'm being honest, I think a lot of times when I'm writing cursive in Russian, I immediately put the cross bar on the cha, and then I pick up and finish the word. But it kind of depends. I think maybe I do it both ways. Okay, so next comes tse. Not hard to write. It looks pretty much like the printed version. Note the little tail on it. As we mentioned already, the main thing here is to note that the tail is really quite compact. So don't put this gigantic loop at the bottom. It starts to look really weird. Note that we do have, again, kind of a little hooking item there, right? You write what looks initially like an E, right? Or it looks like an English U in cursive. You come up and then you come down, right? You don't immediately go straight down and make the little tail. You come up first, you make, and then you come sharply downward again, go back and make this very compact little loop. Again, don't make it gigantic, or it might start looking like a Y, or it just generally looks weird. Okay, next comes cha, right? Looks pretty much like it does in the printed version. So not really much to say about it, I guess. Okay, next comes sha, right? Again, the stroke beneath is optional, but I would highly recommend it, and you would normally do that after you've written out the word. Okay, the letter sha, right, the double consonant or double length consonant, is formed just like a sha, but it's got the little tail, right? So kind of like we just saw with tsa, you want to come up slightly, then go down, make your little tail, keep it very compact, and don't ever put an understroke underneath this, right? That's the one way we differentiate in writing between sha and simple sha without the tail. Okay, look at the hard sign. This is, note the distinctive little, I want to call it a little hat there. You see the little thing there. Now, one thing to remember again is that we're not going to be writing this very often, especially not now. So I'm not sure I'd worry about it a whole lot. Usually when we start seeing hard signs, we revisit this issue of how to write it because students tend to forget. Okay, anyway, next comes u, right? U. You know, that's a new letter, so it's going to take a little bit of getting used to, but it's written all in a single stroke there. Okay, finally comes the soft sign. That can be connected to a preceding letter, but not to a following letter. So ideally, you would never connect that to a following letter. That helps with legibility. Again, if a Russian's writing very quickly, they might join it kind of just as they're writing quickly in one continuous flow, but ideally you would not connect that. Same goes for which is a relatively rare letter. It doesn't connect at all, right? I think it may be the only letter that, even in its lowercase form, never connects. Well, aside maybe from the hard sign. Okay, next comes U. Okay, that's an unfamiliar letter. You're going to have to practice that a little bit, but it's not too hard. It looks kind of like an I without a dot over it, followed by an O, right? So not really too hard to shape, but may take a little practice. And finally, we get the ya, right? So remember there we have the hook, especially important with the lowercase. You know, if we're joining that to a preceding letter, we've got to come up and preserve that little hook. Then it's important, ideally, to come up and make that kind of a sharp backward, 90-degree turn and keep that sharp edge up in the upper right-hand corner. That can help differentiate it more clearly from a yeah. Okay, that does it for today. So keep practicing. Again, there are some other exercises both in today's lesson and on tomorrow's page as well, with some more written exercises and answer keys. And again, I think if you practice this just a little bit for a day or two, you'll get the hang of it pretty well. Just be sure, ideally, let an instructor have a look at your work. Make sure you're not doing something bizarre, and check yourself, right, especially with regard to the hooks and the humps and things like this. Okay, anyway, that's it for today. Until next time, до свидания, товарищи.